Great. So thank you all again for joining us today for this CoC compliance training. This is the third in our training series on CoC compliance for Santa Clara County. As a reminder, this is specific to CoC funding rules and regulations. So if your program does not receive CoC funding, this likely will not apply to you. Today, we are focusing on topics related to housing. In just a moment, I'll turn it over to Eli Hamilton to talk with you about master leasing versus rental assistance. Then Nicole Thomas will talk with you about fair market rent and rent reasonableness. And then I'll guide us through an activity to practice. Time permitting, we will take a brief break. And when we come back, we will jam through several topics, including participant rent contribution calculations, lease requirements, including the Violence Against Women Act, and last but not least, housing quality standards. As we've noted, this training is really meant to provide an overview, and as much as possible, we'll pause for questions and highlight where you can go for additional information to reference. So now I will turn it over to Eli to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Monica. So we're going to start with just a basic survey of leasing and rental assistance, and specifically the ways that they differ. So leasing and rental assistance are just two types of funding that you might have in a CoC grant budget. They're used for, in a basic level, the same thing. They're used to help pay for the cost of or provide housing for people who are participating in CoC funded programs. But typically, for the most part, you're either going to have leasing or you're going to have rental assistance. Now, if you're working in the new transitional housing rapid rehousing project model, we have a couple of those grants in Santa Clara County right now. In that case, you might have both leasing and rental assistance, but they're going to be used, separately in separate parts of that project. They're different types of funding, and we're going to go over some of the ways in which the rules for the two types of funding differ. So on this first slide about the general structure of these two types of funding, it's one of the ways of thinking about this is that leasing dollars are much more tied to the housing and the structure or the unit, and rental assistance dollars tend to be more about helping a person, being tied to a person or helping a person to pay rent. So in leasing dollars, the structure of leasing is always going to look pretty much the same. There is a lease between the grant recipient, so that's the provider, the program, has a lease with a landlord. So the program is actually master leasing the unit, and then of course the tenant or the program participant has a sublease or maybe an occupancy agreement, depending on the type of project, with the provider. Rental assistance can get a little more, it varies a little more in structure. There are three types of rental assistance that are available in the CoC program: tenant-based rental assistance, project-based, and sponsor-based. I'm not going to talk about sponsor-based today because we don't currently, I believe, have any sponsor-based rental assistance in the Santa Clara CoC portfolio, but I'll talk a little bit about TBRA, tenant-based rental assistance, and project-based rental assistance. In all of these models, or in both of those models, tenant-based and project-based, there is a lease between the program participant, so the client, and the landlord directly. And then there will be some sort of rental payment contract between the grant recipient and the landlord, but there's always that direct lease that the tenant has for that unit with a landlord under rental assistance. So going on to the next slide. There are also, for each of these types of funding, there are caps on the amount of rent, on the cost of a unit. So we're not talking about right now about caps on how much you can spend with these funding. It's more about how expensive can a unit be when you're going to use these funds to assist it. So for leasing, when you're looking at the overall cost of a unit, that's which we'll talk about, what that means later on in the training. But when you're looking at the overall cost of a unit for a leasing project, the cost of that unit can be up to fair market rent. but it can't be over fair market rent. And then for the you can pay up to fair market rent with your leasing dollars, but you can't go over fair market rent. And you also can't go over rent reasonableness. So for leasing, if you find a unit that is where the rent is reasonable, but the rent is above FMR, you can't use leasing funds to pay up to FMR for that unit. You have to find a unit where you're paying just rent reasonableness. For rental assistance, on the other hand, you can pay more than fair market rent with your CoC funding. You just can't pay something that is above rent reasonableness. So if you find a unit, which you may definitely in this area, that is under FMR, or is over FMR, right? Our FMRs, can a lot of times be lower than the units we see on the market. So you're finding a unit that's over FMR, but it is definitely reasonable for the area because all of the units in the area are over FMR. You can use rental assistance to pay for up to whatever is reasonable in that area. So it's a slight difference between leasing and rental assistance here. In some ways, it makes rental assistance more flexible, but it also means you have to really watch your rental assistance budget, because if you only receive fair market rent per unit from HUD, so if you're paying above fair market rent per unit from HUD, then you're going to have to find a place in your budget for to get that additional funding. So the next slide gives us a little bit more information about what exactly you can pay for. So clearly you can pay for rent. That's sort of the basic thing. On a leasing project, you're paying the rent on the lease that the project has, that you as the provider have. And then for rental assistance, you're paying some portion of the rent that the client is responsible for to the landlord. But in addition to just paying rent, both leasing and rental assistance have a little bit, some other things that you can pay for. So under leasing and rental assistance, both, you can pay a security deposit that's equal to an amount that's up to 2 months of the rent on the unit. And you can also cover first and last month's rent upfront. For both leasing and rental assistance, you can also pay for what HUD refers to as the costs of carrying out those eligible activities, the staff costs. In this case, that could look like your staff time for cutting checks or otherwise processing rent payments. It could be staff time for doing HQS inspections of units that your clients are looking at or that you want to assist. There's a sort of general set of the staff costs that are necessary in order to administer the leasing funds or the rental assistance funds. We sometimes get a lot of questions specifically about, well, is this cost something that is a cost of carrying out the activity that I could use my rental assistance funds for? If you have specific questions like that, we're obviously not listing out all of those staff costs. So you should always feel free to email us directly with those specific questions about, is this cost eligible? Is it eligible under rental assistance, or could I bill it somewhere else? And then one difference between rental assistance and leasing here is you can use rental assistance funds to pay for property damage to a unit. You can do that up to 1 time per participant. It would have to be at a point where a participant or a client is leaving a unit and the landlord has assessed that there are damage costs that are greater than that security deposit or that damage deposit. In that situation, once per participant, you can use rental assistance funding, if you have it in your budget, to pay for property damages up to the amount of 1 month's rent. You don't have that eligible cost for your leasing dollars, so you can't use leasing funds to pay for damages. That's mostly because if you have a leasing line item in your budget, you also have the option to ask HUD for an operating line item, and the operating line item does have some ability to pay for damage to the unit that you're leasing. If those damages aren't the responsibility of the landlord or are sort of not covered in the security deposit. And so the only difference here really is that those damages will come out of rental assistance for a rental assistance project. Okay, so next slide, please. Utilities. So when HUD thinks about and when HUD talks about housing costs, they consider the entire cost of housing to be rent plus utilities. And both leasing and rental assistance are intended to cover or to take into account the entire housing costs of a unit. So that's both rent and utilities. For a leasing program, if rent is or utilities are included in your rent, the program has a lease with the landlord and the utilities are included in that lease and they're paid by the landlord and you just pay rent, then of course you're using your leasing funds to pay for that because you're using your leasing funds to pay for rent. If your rent and your lease does not include utilities, you can't use your leasing funds to cover the cost of utilities, but if you have an operating line item, you can use your operating funds to pay for utilities. So again, this is a place where HUD is just putting those eligible costs somewhere else. You do have the option when you apply for a grant to ask for that operating line item. You can also include, so if you're a leasing program, you have the option to ask clients to pay rent. And if you're having your clients, all of your participants pay rent, then you're going to factor in the cost of utilities to their rent payments. For rental assistance, you have to factor in the cost of utilities, of any utilities that participants are paying separate from their rent. So again, if that participant has a lease, they have a lease with the landlord and the utilities are covered in their rent, then you're just going to be helping them pay their rent to whatever extent is appropriate. If there are utilities that are not included in the rent and that the participant is responsible for paying, the client has to pay for, then you have to factor that into the total cost of housing. We'll walk through more about what that means when we talk about calculating the client portion of rent, but basically it means you have to take into account utilities that the client is paying for outside of their total rent cost when you're figuring out how much rent they should be paying. So the next slide takes us through some of an area where we actually get a lot of questions: vacancy payments. What happens when I had a client, I was assisting a client in a unit, and that client vacates the unit before the end of their lease, or just unexpectedly, or even expectedly if the client is moving out. For example, we know that when clients are housed, it does happen fairly frequently that clients may go into a residential treatment program, or a client may end up incarcerated. And if that time in an institutional setting is going to be it's typically over 90 days, then that's considered a vacancy. So that might be one example of a situation where a unit is vacant when a client goes into an institution. So in a leasing program, because the program has that lease with the landlord, your lease is for a particular term, maybe it's for 1 year, and you are obligated to abide by the terms of that lease. You have to pay that rent for the term of 1 year. If your client vacates the unit in the middle of that lease, say 6 months in, you can't then break your lease with the landlord unless there's a lease provision that specifically says this lease ends when the tenant moves out. You still have this lease, you're responsible for paying it. So you can use CoC funding to continue to pay the rent on that unit until the end of the lease term, right? Until the lease comes to its natural end. Rental assistance is a little different. So because it's not the program that has the lease, it's the client. If the client vacates the unit, then you can continue making payments on that unit to continue supporting that rent for up to 30 days after the end of the month in which the client vacates. So if the client moves out of the unit for whatever reason on April 20th, then you've already probably paid April rent, and you can pay May rent on that vacant unit. which may give you a little bit of time to work with the landlord, maybe to get another client in that unit, um, potentially to try to work with the client who vacated the unit to go back, if that's if you are still in touch with them and that's something they're interested in. You have some flexibility, but there is a limit. You can only pay for up to one additional month. And then finally, on the next slide, I just want to point out some things to watch out for when you're using and planning for these funds. So for leasing funds, I think this will make sense to everybody. You can't use leasing funds to lease a unit that your agency owns. Basically, generally speaking, you can't pay rent to yourself for a unit that you own or that's owned by your parent organization or by a subrecipient of these grant funds. HUD doesn't want you to be paying rent to yourself, except if you can tell HUD, hey, I own this unit, but I want to pay myself rent. I have a really good reason, and you can convince them that there's a good reason. They can give you permission to do that. And then on the other side, rental assistance. I want to note that it's actually pretty common for rental assistance projects to have rental assistance funding left over. This is partly, I would say primarily, because HUD funds your grants at the amount of fair market rent for each unit that you have in your grant agreement. But in most rental assistance projects, non-rapid rehousing rental assistance projects, you have to assess the client's income and then charge them rent. So for every client that has an income of more than $0, they're going to be actually paying some portion of that unit cost. So you're getting paid the full FMR, but because the client is paying some portion of the rent, you may actually be paying out less than FMR per unit, depending on the cost of the units. So that's something to think about. That little tiny bit of extra that you might have per unit can be used to potentially pay more than FMR for some units when you can't find a lower priced unit. In some cases, that can be used to cover the staff costs of administering rental assistance. So you might put that towards your HQS inspections and your staff time for doing those, or your staff time for cutting checks. Okay, I know that was quite a survey type approach to this. We jumped around a little bit. But on the next slide, I wanted to just touch back on the vacancy information that we covered. And I want to do a little quiz. Now with these quizzes, don't worry if you don't know the answer. That's not so much the point. The point of these quizzes is to help you activate the stuff that I just told you to make this a little bit more interactive, because the more you get your brain thinking about a thing, even if you don't get to the right answer on your own, then we can talk about it afterwards, and that's actually going to help that information activate and stick more in your brain. So that's the reason we're throwing these quizzes in here. So this particular quiz, you have a leasing program in this scenario, and you have a tenant who exited their CoC assisted unit that you're using your leasing funds on. The recipient's lease, so the program's lease with the landlord, ends automatically after 6 months of vacancy. How long can the program continue to use CoC program leasing funds to pay for this vacant unit? All right, I'm going to throw up a poll question here. All right, so you should see the poll question launched. Go ahead and have a think. It's a leasing program. You have a lease with the landlord, and it ends automatically after 6 months of vacancy, and you have a vacant unit. How long can you keep using your leasing funds to assist that unit while it's vacant? And your choices are until the end of the months that the client exited, until the lease ends 6 months after the client exits, or CoC leasing funds can't be used to pay for vacant units. I'm seeing some responses coming in. I'm aiming for at least, all right, great. We have over 50% of people responding. That's fantastic. I'll give you just a couple more seconds if you're still noodling. Okay, great. All right, so you can see the anonymous results, and I'm so glad that there's a little bit of difference here in the responses we got, because then I can talk about it, and I love to talk. So the correct answer here is what most of you sort of caught on was the until the lease ends 6 months after the client exits. That's because in leasing you're responsible for abiding by the terms of your lease, and under the terms of this lease, the lease doesn't end until 6 months after a vacancy. So you're actually both allowed and also obligated to pay for the vacancy for that long. Until the end of the month that the client exited, that's really close to the rule for rental assistance. The rule for rental assistance would actually be until the end of the month after the month that the client exited. So you get a little bit more time even than that. Okay. So thank you for participating in that poll. We appreciate your active participation. And it looks like we got one question in the chat. I'm going to answer this question. If you have any questions about this section, this is a great time to throw those in the chat. So we got a question. If a participant in a rental assistance program passes away and they live alone, do you pay rent for 30 days or the end of the month? Great question. Okay, we'll start there. I think there's a second part to the question. So do you and can you, I think, are two different questions. This is a case of a vacancy, right? The client lives alone. So if the client passes away, that unit is vacant. If you've already paid rent for the month during which the client passes away, then you've already paid that rent, right? That's sort of outside of the question. But the next month, the following month after the client passes away, that's really up to you. You don't have to pay that additional month of rent while the unit is vacant, but you can choose to. It's an eligible use of funding. You're allowed to. HUD allows you to pay that extra month. You're not required, but you're allowed to. And the reason that you might want to do that is if you have another client who might be interested in that unit and the landlord has worked well and they're willing to fill that unit with another client. If you need to hold that unit vacant a little bit in order to find a client who wants the unit or to get the client ready to move in, that might be a reason you would pay vacancy, but you would never have to. If that doesn't answer your question, go ahead and submit a follow-up. And then for a household that has other household members, oh, got it. You would pay for the 30-day max, but wasn't sure if this would be the same for a single household member. Yeah, exactly. Great. All right. Any other questions about the leasing rental assistance difference? All right. Well, with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Nicole, who's going to talk about FMR and rent reasonableness.
Thanks, Eli. So there are two ways a CoC program can determine rent. They can look to fair market rent or rent reasonableness. So we'll first start with covering the definition of both and what they entail, and then we'll cover when you might look to one over the other to determine rent limits. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the definition of fair market rent. In order to ensure that a reasonable supply of rental housing is accessible to participants, HUD established an estimate of gross rent that includes both the rent and the utilities. This excludes costs such as telephone, internet, cable, and satellite fees, however. FMR numbers are updated annually and published on October 1st. Next slide, please. The HUD website provides FMRs for many years, so you're going to want to make sure you're using the correct FMR for your project. You'll need to know your project's start and end date. So for example, if your project's start date is September 1st, 2019, you're going to use the 2019 FMR numbers until the end of that project, which would be August 31st, 2020. On this slide, you can see the FMR numbers for 2019 and 2020 for the geographic area of San Jose, Sunnyvale, and Santa Clara. You'll note that the FMR numbers are broken down by number of bedrooms. Next slide, please. So now we'll cover the definition of rent reasonableness, which, as the name would suggest, means that rent for CoC assisted units must be reasonable compared to rents paid for unassisted units that are in a similar location, that have similar size, quality, and age, and have similar amenity and utility offerings. Next slide, please. So now we're going to cover whether you'd look to FMR or rent reasonableness to determine capped limits. So for leasing a unit, you can never exceed FMR or rent reasonableness because you're capped at whichever is the lower of the two. I will note that in response to COVID-19, HUD has made available a set of temporary time-limited waivers, and one of these waivers pertains to capped limits for leased units. So with this waiver, if the lease was executed between the window of March 31st to September 30th, you will be able to pay above FMR for as long as that lease is in effect. So that includes extensions and automatic renewals. So with this waiver, you can exceed FMR, but you're still capped at rent reasonableness. I want to reiterate that this waiver is time limited. So if you're referencing this recording at a later point, you want to check when the execution of the lease was to confirm whether this might be applicable to you or not. Moving on to leasing a structure, you're capped at rent reasonableness. For rental assistance, you can exceed FMR, but you're capped at rent reasonableness. If a recipient pays rent beyond FMR for some units in a project, they must ensure that they have sufficient funding, such as program participant rent contributions or lower rents in other areas, that would allow them to continue to serve the contracted number of participants for the remainder of the grant term. Next slide, please. Now we'll go over an example as a quick comprehension check. So for the leased unit, and we'll look at the one-bedroom unit, would you be capped at reasonable rent, which is $850, or fair market rent, which would be $775? For this example, we're going to assume that the waiver is not applicable, and I'm going to launch a poll right now. So again, are we capped at $850 or $775? Okay, I'm seeing some answers trickle in. Gonna give it a few more seconds. Just a couple more. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll right now. So I'm seeing some variety between $850 and $775. So we want to remind ourselves that for leased units, you're capped at whichever is the lower of the two. So in this instance, the fair market rent was the lowest. It was $775. So that's where you'd be capped at. This means that the recipient can only spend up to $775 out of the CoC leasing budget. The $75 difference between $850 and $775 can be paid from other resources, however. Next slide, please. Now we'll go over an example for a rental assistance unit, and we'll look at the two-bedroom units this time. So would we be capped at the reasonable rent, which is $1,325, or the fair market rent of $1,400? And I'll launch the second poll right now. I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, wonderful. And I'm gonna end the poll right now. Okay, so again, I'm seeing a split between reasonable rent and fair market rent. For rental assistance units, you can exceed fair market rent, but you're always capped at rent reasonableness. And in this example, the reasonable rent was lower than the FMR. So you're capped at $1,325. It's important to note that unlike leasing programs, which can use non-CoC funds to cover the difference between FMR or rent reasonableness and rent, rental assistance programs are prohibited from subsidizing units that exceed rent reasonableness. Next slide, please. So now we'll just remind ourselves of a couple of things. FMR is published online by HUD for corresponding geographic areas, and the FMR numbers are updated annually, so you're going to you want to make sure that you're using the correct FMR numbers that correspond to your grant start and end date. Rent reasonableness is determined by recipients and subrecipients, and when considering gross rent, you want to take into account the unit type, location, the condition of the unit, and the utility and amenity offerings. Next slide, please. Recipients and subrecipients are responsible for determining what documentation is required to ensure that rent reasonableness standard is met for each unit, and they're responsible for maintaining that documentation and including supporting evidence for all assisted units in client files. Comparable rents vary over time, so you want to ensure that the comparison is up to date and appropriate for each unit. And we believe that an annual basis is reasonably compliant with updating consistently. Next slide, please. So examples of rent reasonableness documentation include a market study of rents charged. Market studies can determine the value of certain features and what drives rent. Before your agency decides to conduct a market study of its own, you might want to look to agencies that collect and aggregate data, such as the Public Housing Agency, Chamber of Commerce, or commercial real estate firms, because they often publish market studies of rent. You'll want to note that market studies can often focus on very particular housing types, however, and a lot of times market studies do not include utilities, so that's an important consideration to note. Another example of rent reasonableness documentation is a review of advertisements for comparable units. You can print out 3 comparable units with evidence of similar feature offerings. Another example is written verification from a property owner or management company that confirms that rent is comparable to that of which they charge for similar unassisted units. Next slide, please. Recipients and subrecipients must establish clear written policies and procedures for documenting rent reasonableness. And this should cover the methodology for documenting comparable rents, the checklists and forms that will be included in case files, standards for certifying comparable rents as reasonable, staffing assignments, and strategies that will be used to address special circumstances. Next slide, please. Because the FMR includes utilities in its estimate, rent reasonableness must consider the entire housing cost that, according to the lease, is the responsibility of the tenant. So rent reasonableness should include utilities such as gas and oil, electric, water, sewage, and trash removal. And again, costs such as telephone, internet, cable, satellite fees are ineligible utilities and should not be included. Furthermore, gross rent does not include late fees that a participant may accrue for failing to pay rent in a timely fashion. Next slide, please. So a uniform rent reasonableness policy across the community reduces barriers to housing for program participants. Providers are encouraged to adopt the policy set by the Office of Supportive Housing or submit their own policy for OSH approval. OSH's policy lays out the purpose of a rent reasonableness standard and the necessary steps that must be taken to determine whether a unit meets this standard. Next slide, please. So according to OSH's policy, no less than 3 up-to-date comparable units must be used for rent reasonableness review. A market study or advertisements are acceptable methods of documenting rent reasonableness. For advertisements, unit listings must be printed and attached to the form that outlines the comparison of the units. On the next slide, we'll see a sample of what this form looks like. So on this slide, we can see that you would fill out the 3 comparable units alongside the proposed unit, and you would compare it across gross rent, but also the type of the unit, the age of the unit, condition, and utility and amenity offerings. Next slide, please. Another acceptable method of documentation is written signed verification by the property owner or management company that confirms that they have similar market rate units that are currently rented at comparable rates. Again, when considering gross rent, it is rent plus the cost of utilities. OSHA's policy states that gas, electric, water, sewer, and trash are eligible utility costs. As I mentioned earlier, recipients and subrecipients are responsible for determining the rent reasonableness standard, and OSHA set the standard for within $100. So this means only unit rents that are no more than $100 above the average of the 3 comparable rents will be considered rent reasonable. Could we go back a slide, please? So here you'll see that in Part A, you would calculate the proposed gross unit rent. In Part B, you would calculate the average gross rent of the 3 comparable units. And in Part C, you would have to confirm that the proposed unit's gross rent is within $100 of the average that was calculated in Part B. Okay, can we go back now? Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions I might be able to answer on rent reasonableness or fair market rent. And I'll give it a couple of seconds because I know it can take some time to type out questions. In the case that there aren't any questions, but I'll keep an eye out on the chat, I'm just going to launch one last poll for this section, just as a quick comprehension check. So this is a true or false question. So OSHA's rent reasonableness standard states that unit rents that are no more than $50 above the average of the 3 comparable rents will be considered rent reasonable. Is this true or false? Okay, I'm seeing some responses trickle in, and I'm still seeing no questions in the chat as of yet, which is fine. But if you have questions at a later point, please feel free to email us, and we're happy to be of assistance. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. Can I get one more person to respond, maybe? Awesome, thank you.
I'd respond if I could, because I'm a cheater, but I can't.
And I'm seeing most people said false, which is correct. It would have been a true statement if it said no more than $100, because that's the standard that OSHA set. Okay, thank you for participating. I'm going to hand it over to Monica, and she'll be walking us through an activity that will put this into practice.
Great. Thank you, Nicole, for that helpful overview. So yes, now we're going to go through and practice. And if any questions come up while we do so, please feel free to put those in the chat box. So to kick off, let's return to the rent reasonableness checklist and certification form that Nicole introduced to us. As she mentioned, this is up on the Santa Clara County CoC website under Program Management CoC Forms. Also on that webpage is a one-page user guide for this form to help explain all of the various units within the form. For now, we're going to focus on the top half, which enables you to compare the proposed unit, so the unit that your client would like to rent, with 3 comparable units. You'll compare them, as Nicole mentioned, for things like the number of bedrooms, the type of unit, if it's a single family home or an apartment, for example, the condition of the housing, and any utilities or amenities that are included. So let's get started. Our proposed unit, and I will remind you of these details on subsequent slides, so no worries about detailed note taking. Our proposed unit is a 2-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It is 600 square feet. It's in a high-rise building that was built in 1990, and it's in good condition. Amenities include laundry in the building, new appliances, near public transportation, and ADA accessible. And finally, gas utilities are included in the rent. So now the details from this proposed unit are going to pop up on subsequent slides as a little red box on the side as we start to look at other units and determine together whether or not these other units are comparable to this one. So the first unit that we're going to look at is a 2-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It's 630 square feet, and it's in a low-rise building that was built in 1987 that is in good condition. Amenities included are laundry in the building, new appliances, near public transit, and it's ADA accessible. And finally, gas utilities are included in the rent. So what I'm going to do here is launch a poll to ask you, does Unit 1 seem comparable to the proposed unit that the client would like to rent? And again, the little red box on the side reminds us of the details of the proposed unit. So I'll give you some time to let us know whether Unit 1 seems comparable to the proposed unit. So we're looking at things like number of bedrooms, location, square footage, age, condition, amenities, and utilities. And I'm seeing some responses come in. I'll give us another couple seconds to see if we can get up to 50%. Okay, great. I'll go ahead and stop us there. So yes, it does seem as though this unit is comparable for purposes of this comparison. It's got the same number of bedrooms. It's pretty similar in terms of its size and when it was built. It's got similar utilities and similar amenities. Wonderful. Now let's look at our second option. The second unit for our consideration is a studio apartment in Mountain View. It's 350 square feet, and it's an in-law unit that was built in 1970 and is in fair condition. It does not include laundry, and it is not accessible. Gas utilities are not included in the rent. And again, we've got the box on the side to remind us of the proposed unit. And I'll ask you again here, does Unit 2 seem comparable to the proposed unit? Great, we've got a bunch of responses coming in. I'll give us another few seconds in case anyone else would like to weigh in. And as a reminder, these are anonymous, so feel free to let us know what you think, and you'll not be called out, I promise. Okay, great. So we've got a bit of a mix here, but it does seem on balance that it's likely this unit would not be considered comparable. We are looking here at different cities, different numbers of bedrooms, a studio versus a 2-bedroom. Quite a difference in size, 350 square feet versus 600. And we do have a difference in terms of amenities and utilities that are included. So it does seem on balance that Unit 2 would not be considered to be comparable. Great. So moving right along, because as we'll remember for our rent reasonableness checklist and certification, we do need to find 3 units that are comparable. So right now we've got one that is and one that isn't. Let's take a look at unit number 3. Unit number 3 is a 2-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It is 550 square feet. in a high-rise building built in 1980 that is in good condition. The amenities include laundry in the building, new appliances, it's walking distance to community amenities such as a library and a grocery store, and it is ADA accessible. Finally, gas utilities are included in the rent. So again, I will launch a poll here to ask you, does Unit 3 seem comparable? And as responses come in, we'll note that it's going to start to get a little bit more challenging here. And I just want to make a couple of notes. This can get really challenging, and sometimes it's more of an art than a science. We're looking at 2-bedroom units here, and so those are pretty common. Whereas if your client needed something like a 4-bedroom or a 6-bedroom unit, you'd need to look further, possibly at different cities, to find units that are comparable. Also, your client may have needs that are not reflected in the rent reasonableness chart, such as they have children who they'd like to keep in the same school district. So whatever the circumstances are of your client that make a unit comparable or not comparable, you'll want to document into the client's file so that HUD can see your thinking. Great, so we've got some great responses in the chat. I'll give you a couple more seconds in case anybody else wants to weigh in here. Okay, wonderful. So again, here we've got a bit of a mix, but we are leaning towards yes. It does seem that on balance, Unit 3 is comparable. It's a 2-bedroom unit in Gilroy, pretty similar in terms of size, 550 versus 600 square feet. It's in good condition and in a high-rise building, and it does have similar amenities. However, here we'll notice walking distance to community-based locations versus transit. Here, it's not likely that it's a deal breaker for your client, but if you have a client who needs to take public transit to get to work, for example, that might mean that this unit is not comparable. For purposes of this exercise, though, we'll say that on balance, it's likely that this unit is comparable.
And Monica, thanks for calling out that this does sometimes get really complicated, and like thinking of it as an art versus a science is really apt metaphor, because you can't most of the time be looking for the exact same unit, and so it's most of the time you're not going to be able to find 3 units that hit all of these exactly. And what you're doing is weighing, well, how important, how significant is this difference? Like Monica's been calling out the number of bedrooms, because we tend to see that as a pretty significant difference, studio versus 2 bedrooms. But again, when it does get more difficult, when you're looking for a unit type that is really rare, like a 6-bedroom unit, that's when you might, as Monica said, want to expand, and there might not be any 6-bedroom units to compare to in that neighborhood or in that city. So yeah.
Awesome. No, thanks for highlighting that, Eli. Great. So let's take a look at another unit here, because we've got 2 that are comparable, but we do need 3. So let's take a look at unit number 4. Unit number 4 is a 3-bedroom apartment in Gilroy. It is 800 square feet and in a high-rise building built in 2010 that is in good condition. The amenities include laundry in the unit, new appliances, walking distance to community locations, and it's ADA accessible. And electric utilities are included in the rent. So again, I'll launch a poll here to ask if tech will allow me. Does Unit 4 seem comparable? So here we've got a 3-bedroom as compared to a 2, 800 square feet as compared to 6, built in 2010 as compared to 1990. Yeah, we're getting a bit of a mix of responses here. So let's let folks another couple of seconds to see what we think. Okay, great. We'll go ahead and end the poll here. And it's a pretty close one here. We do have folks leaning towards yes, but we also have a number of folks who are leaning no. I think for purpose of this activity, as Eli highlighted, number of bedrooms is a pretty big difference here. So looking at a 3-bedroom versus a 2-bedroom is going to make quite a difference. Also, an 800 square foot apartment versus a 600 square foot. I know I'm living in something that's more of a 500 square foot, and if I had 800 square feet to shelter in place right now, I'd feel pretty different. So we are, for purposes of this activity, going to lean towards no, that this unit would not be comparable, mostly based on the number of bedrooms and the size and how new it is. But again, as we've noted, it can definitely be more of an art than a science. And so thank you so much for participating. So with your indulgence, we're going to look at one final unit here, unit number 5. So again, we're back to considering a 2-bedroom unit in Gilroy. It is 650 square feet, built in 1995 in a high-rise building in good condition. The amenities include laundry in the building, a balcony, being near transit and ADA accessible, and propane utilities are included. So for our final poll for this activity, does Unit 5 seem comparable? Great, and they're coming pretty quickly now. You may have picked up on my hint that thus far for this activity, we've only got 2 comparable units and we need 3. So indeed, for purposes of this activity, Unit 5 does seem comparable. Very good. We've got 100% response there. Thank you so much for participating. So now that we have identified 3 comparable units, we can return to our checklist and certification. So again, we're looking at the top half of the rent reasonableness checklist from the CoC's website, now filled in with the proposed unit and 3 comparable units. You'll see now that near the bottom of this form, we have filled in the rents. We didn't consider those during the activity because what we were looking for, as Eli and Nicole pointed out, was units that are comparable in terms of size and type and amenities. Now we're moving on to the second phase of our analysis, which is considering whether the rent is reasonable as compared to these comparable units. So to look now at the bottom half of that form, which Nicole introduced us to a bit ago, Section A has the proposed rent for the proposed unit. Section B has comparable units. And in Section C, we certify whether it's rent reasonable. As Nicole introduced us to, the proposed unit's gross rent, which we calculate in Section A, must be within $100 of the average gross rent of comparable units in Section B. And if this is true, we'll sign the form to certify the rent is rent reasonable. Here, the proposed unit gross rent in Section A is $2,824. The average gross rent for the comparable units is $2,892. These 2 figures are within $100 of each other, so we can certify that this is rent reasonable. Thank you so much for participating in this activity. We'll pause here to see if there are any questions. Okay, so I think we'll give you some more time to think through if there are any questions. For now, we do know that this training is quite long, and so we're going to give ourselves a few minutes break. It is currently 2:59, so how about let's plan to return. We're going to start up again at 3:05. So we'll go ahead and pause here. Please.
Yeah, and I'm gonna put up a poll. So when you come back to your desk, you'll see a poll that says, "Are you back?" And when you're back, just click yes, so we know when we have one coming back.
Awesome. Thanks, Eli. And if we want to, we can pause the recording now too as well. And we'll see you all in just a few minutes.
I need to do that. So we're gonna go to our next section, which is calculating the client portion of rent. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're going to do an overview of how you calculate how much rent a client should be paying. And I want to emphasize that this is an overview. It is very possible, and we've done it. It's possible to do a whole hour-and-a-half training on calculating client rent. And we have materials that cover this very in depth that we can point you to. But for purposes of this training, because the whole thing is an overview giving you a flavor of the different grant requirements, we won't go into that huge amount of depth in this training. But I want to give you a sense of the scope of what you're thinking about and what you're doing when you're calculating how much rent a client should pay. First slide, please. So generally, as a general standard, when you hear client portion of rent or how much rent a client should be paying, this is the HUD standard that your mind should go to. A client's or a tenant's rent shouldn't exceed either 30% of what we call their adjusted income or 10% of their gross income, whichever is higher. Their adjusted income, monthly adjusted income, is something that I'm going to show you how to calculate. It's a specific HUD calculation to get to that adjusted income. And then their gross income is just all of the money that's coming in. So you're going to calculate adjusted income and check whether 30% of adjusted income or 10% of gross income is higher. And then that's going to be the rent your client's going to pay, or the cap to the rent your client is going to pay. Rental assistance and leasing are a little bit different on this point as well. For rental assistance projects that are permanent supportive housing or transitional housing, sort of the basic rule for those rental assistance projects is you have to charge rent, and you have to charge the highest of those two calculations. So when we say you have to charge rent, it's based on these rent limits. So if your client has zero income, you're going to be charging their client portion of the rent is going to be $0, because 10% or 30% of zero is zero. But you still have to, for every client, figure out what their income is. For a leasing project, you are not required by HUD to charge rent at all. But if you do choose to charge rent, you have to do that the same way for every client. So it's either a yes, you charge rent for every client, or no, you don't charge rent for any clients. And you have to, the cap of the rent you can charge follows this rule. So you can't charge more than the higher of these two options. Next slide, please. When you're calculating client portion of rent in both leasing and rental assistance projects, you need to do that initially. If you're going to charge rent in leasing and then always in rental assistance projects, you need to, when the client enters your project and finds a unit, figure out how much is the client portion of rent. And then in rental assistance projects, you want to be reassessing that at least annually. That's sort of a reasonable understanding of regularly, so annually. And then as for both leasing and rental assistance, as your client's income changes, particularly if your client's income goes down and it would result in them paying less as their client portion of rent, you want to reassess on an interim basis so that you're never unduly burdening your client with the rent payment. Next slide, please. So when I first talked about rental assistance, I mentioned that the general rule for rental assistance projects for PSH and transitional housing was that 30% of adjusted or 10% of gross. That's because there's a very specific exception and a specific rule for rapid rehousing projects. So HUD specifically says CoC funded rapid rehousing projects are not bound by this 30%, 10% rule. Rapid rehousing projects just have to follow whatever the CoC puts in their written standards. And then each individual grant recipient or program has to have their own written policies about calculating client portion of rent that comply with the CoC's written standards. So in the case of rapid rehousing projects in particular, HUD doesn't actually set the rules about client calculation of rent. It's the CoC that does that. So we're going to look a little bit at what the Santa Clara County CoC says about calculating rapid rehousing rents on the next slide. So the Santa Clara Rapid Rehousing Standards lay out the rules for rapid rehousing projects in Santa Clara County CoC. And generally speaking, rapid rehousing subsidies have to decline over time based on a fixed timeline as determined by the program. So this gives some leeway and responsibility for the program to establish your own written policies and procedures. And you can change or revise or be flexible with that fixed timeline as needed to respond to changes in the client's circumstances. Clients should be paying a percentage of the rent on the unit, which is a little bit different than paying a percentage of their income, right? You're going to be basing this on a percentage of the total unit rent, the gross rent, based on the program's assessment of the client's financial and family situation. So as you set up this fixed step down, and then as you're looking at how to change that and modify it, you're taking into account the client's financial and family situation and being flexible when the client needs you to be. So just keep in mind, if you're a rapid rehousing provider, you're going to be looking to your own program policies and procedures and to this CoC written standards, and you may not be taking into account any of the rest of the information that I'm going to be giving you. So I wanted to put that up front. Okay, so the next slide gets us into your typical HUD rent calculation approach. So this is definitely going to apply to any leasing project that charges rent, and then any rental assistance project for PSH or for transitional housing. Typically, when you're calculating the client's portion of rent, the first step is figuring out how much income that client has. And all of those steps that we're going to walk through require that you document what you're doing. You document each of the steps of calculating the client's adjusted income with what HUD refers to as verified information. This is just something that documents the information that you're putting into the rent calculation worksheet or whatever tool you're using. So the type of verified information you're going to use may differ based on what type of information you're documenting. One example is you need third-party verification of employment income, or you need to try to get third-party verification of employment income if you can. But for something like household composition, you don't need third-party verification of household composition. That should be probably a statement from the household themselves, from the client. So different types of verified information for different pieces. Next slide, please. So there are a number of steps to calculating a client portion of rent using that 30%, 10% HUD standard. Step one is always going to be to determine the household's total annual income. That's where you're starting. And then the next 5 steps are going to be determining their eligibility for different allowances. An allowance is just something that HUD has created to deduct certain amounts of income from the total adjusted income. That's what the adjusted means. Once you've determined whether a household qualifies for each allowance and then how much that allowance is going to be, step number 7 is actually calculating the adjusted annual income by subtracting all of those allowances from the total income you calculated in step 1. And then based on the adjusted annual income, you're going to figure out what the appropriate amount of resident rent should be. That seems like that's the end, right? You've figured out the client portion of rent. There's actually a last step because of the point that we've referenced a couple times now, that HUD considers all of those eligible utilities as part of the total housing costs. So you need to check to see if a utility allowance or utility payment to the client is necessary in this particular situation. Okay, so we're going to go quickly through these steps. Again, we're not going to go deeply into any one in particular, but give you an overview of these steps. Okay, so for step one on the next slide, you want to make sure you know all of the members of the household. And for each of those members, you're going to be identifying the anticipated income over the next year. That's a key part through all of these steps when we're talking about figuring out what income is going to happen or even what expenses are going to happen a little bit later on. You're anticipating what that income is going to be over the next year. And then you want to figure out what types of income are included in this total income and what types of income are excluded. I haven't put the categories of included income and excluded income on the slide, but we do have a lot of resources available that we can provide to you that delineate these are the types of income that you should include. For example, salary and wages from employment is included typically, but sometimes there are types of income that are the client is getting, they're coming in, but you put them in the excluded column. So we have resources to help you figure out which is which for a particular client. And then whatever tool you're using, there's a HUD tool that's pretty common called the rent calculation worksheet, but I know different agencies have different tools for doing this income calculation. You want to make sure you're putting in information about all of the client's income, whether it's included in your total income calculation for HUD or excluded. You want to put it all in your documentation so HUD knows that you know about all the income and that you're appropriately categorizing it as being included in your calculation or excluded. All right, so that's step one. And again, stop me if you have questions, but this is definitely going to be an overview, so we're not going to get deep into how to do all of that. I do want to pause here though on the next slide for just, I think this should be hopefully an easy quiz question, an easy poll. I'm going to throw this up here. Okay, so if you are trying to calculate a client's income for this step one of rent calculation, and you're not sure whether to include a particular type of income, if you should be marked as included or excluded, what are your options? Could you review handouts and materials from this training? Could you check with your agency or your team or some resource that you have available to you? Could you email us with a question like that? What do you think are your options? Or could you do all of the above? Yeah, all right, I see some responses coming in. This isn't a hugely controversial question, but I'm going to give folks a chance to weigh in here. See if we can get a couple more people giving us their opinion. All right, I'm going to close the poll in just a couple seconds. Yeah, all right. So I'm glad to say that 100% of you recognize that all of those are options to you. I want to particularly plug the emailing home base. We love to get your emails. We love to get your questions. Personally, I love just any opportunity I get to answer a question that I actually know the answer to. It's really relaxing for me. So please do reach out with your questions when you have them. Okay, next slide. The next slide takes us into the first of those allowances that I mentioned. And this is the dependent allowance. So to figure out whether your client household qualifies for this allowance, you just ask, are there any dependents? Are there any minors in the household? Are there any household members who have a disability according to HUD's definition, which I have actually included in the presentation a little bit later? Are there any full-time students? These aren't necessarily our typical concept of a dependent, but if there's anybody in the household that meets those definitions, then you qualify for the dependent allowance of $480 per dependent. Next slide takes us to another type of allowance. So this is our second allowance we're checking for, the child care allowance. To figure out whether your client household qualifies for this allowance, you check the household composition. Are there any children that are 12 years of old or under? And then are there any anticipated childcare costs? So that's over the next year. Does the household anticipate any costs of childcare for that 12-year-old child or younger in order to permit another household member to go to work or to pursue an education? So there's a lot of boxes to check there. It has to be a child under 12 years or older under. The childcare costs can't be reimbursed or reimbursable, right? So if you're going to get maybe TANF childcare reimbursement or some other type of reimbursement, and it has to, the reason for the childcare has to be able to allow another household member to work or pursue an education. But if those check boxes are all checked, then the next slide shows us how to calculate that allowance. So you take the total reasonable childcare expenses. Reasonable just means kind of what you would expect childcare to cost in this area. And then, of course, you're going to ignore or subtract any amounts that are expected to be reimbursed. And you're only going to take into account those costs that are for the childcare that is needed to allow a household member to work. And that's going to be the total cost that you're going to deduct as an allowance. So the next couple of allowances have to do with household members that have disabling conditions. And I mentioned that I'd give you the definition of that in this training. So the next slide shows us that HUD sort of has three options within its definition of disability. And if a household member meets any one of these options, then they are a household member with a disability according to HUD's definition. So the first definition is on this slide, and then the next slide has your two other options. All right. I'm not going to go deep into this. We do cover this in the chronic homeless definition training that we did last week, and that is recorded. So if you want someone talking you through these definitions, you might want to go to the chronic homeless definition chronic homeless documentation training and find the portion on documenting disabilities, because we do dig into this definition. But just know that there is a HUD definition of disability that I'm referring to. So the next slide gets us into the next allowance that we're looking at, which is the Disabled Assistance Allowance. So in order to determine whether your client qualifies for the Disabled Assistance Allowance, you want to check whether they anticipate any unreimbursed expenses, either for care for a household member with a disability or for some kind of apparatus for a household member with a disability. And that care or that apparatus, that maybe a wheelchair or some other type of material thing that helps them, that allows that person with a disability to work, or that allows another household member to work. And the Disabled Assistance Allowance is actually connected, it's closely connected to the next allowance we're going to talk about. So we're going to go on to the Medical Expenses Allowance on the next slide. So determine whether your household qualifies for the Medical Expenses Allowance. You're going to ask, does this household have a head of household or the head of household spouse that is 62 years of age or older, or has a disability? And in that case, if the household qualifies, then you're going to look at any anticipated unreimbursed medical expenses of the entire household for the following year. So for the Disabled Assistance Allowance, which was the previous one we went over, and the Medical Expenses Allowance, which is this one, I've told you how to figure out if your household qualifies or is eligible for these allowances. The next slide is going to show you how to figure out the size of that allowance, because HUD actually connects these two allowances together. And HUD says that you can, the amount of the allowance is the amount of the unreimbursed disabled assistance expenses that you looked at in the first allowance, up to the amount it's capped at the amount that is earned as a result of that disabled assistance, right? So the assistance is to enable someone in the household to work. So you take into account all of the expenses for that assistance up to the amount that is earned as a result. And then you add those unreimbursed medical expenses. And if that total amount is over 3% of the household's annual income, then the amount that's over 3% can be deducted. That's the amount of the allowance that you're subtracting. So I know that's a lot. That's all I'm going to say about that. But it's here for you. The rule is here for you to pick apart. And if you want to call me later and we can talk it out, I can give you some more breakdown of that. But that's essentially the rule. The next allowance we're going to look at is the elderly and disabled household allowance. So for this one, you're also looking to see whether the household has a head of household or a spouse that's 62 years of age or older or has a disability. So it's the same qualifying situation as the previous allowance we looked at. In this case, though, if the household meets those criteria, it's automatically entitled to a $400 allowance. We just walked through all of the allowances. That's it. It's a lot, I know. But that does mean that we're ready to go on to the next slide and the next step, which is calculating the actual adjusted annual income, right? So as I mentioned at the top, the way that you adjust the total annual income is you take the total income and you subtract all of the allowances. That part, once you've calculated the allowances, is pretty easy. Next slide, please. And now you have the total adjusted income. You have the total income, you've subtracted your allowances, and you're ready to determine what the appropriate amount of resident rent is. So you're going to take 30% of the monthly adjusted income, which is just the total adjusted income that you calculated, that yearly adjusted income divided by 12. And multiplied by 0.3. So you're 30 to get the 30%. And then you're going to compare 30% of monthly adjusted income to 10% of that total, the gross income, figure out which one is higher, and that's your rent amount or your rent cap. So the next slide takes us through a bit of a quiz. But I'm going to give you this one. I'm not going to make you answer a quiz because I want to get to the utility allowance questions here. So this question is, what's the missing step here, right? We have the first step, determine household annual income. The second step, check each allowance to determine which applies. And then the fourth step is to calculate the client portion of rent. That missing piece here, which of course you all would have identified because you are all brilliant and have photographic memories, that third step is to subtract your allowances, right? Once you've determined which allowances apply, you subtract those allowances from the household's annual income. All right, but I warned you at the beginning that this isn't the end of the process. There's one more step we have to go through, step 9, which is on the next slide for us. The last step is to determine the utility allowance that your client may qualify for. Utility allowance rules apply to all project types, including projects that don't actually require participants to pay rent or an occupancy charge. So you may need to apply a utility allowance for a client who is not paying rent under certain circumstances. Those circumstances are, is the client responsible for paying utilities that are not included in the rent? If your client isn't responsible for paying any utilities, then they're not going to be eligible for a utility allowance. But if there are utilities that the client is paying and they're paying that as a separate payment outside of rent, then you need to check for the utility allowance that they're eligible for. Next slide, please. In order to determine the reasonable utility allowance amount, you're going to use the Public Housing Authority's Schedule of Utility Allowances. I've linked that on this slide. This is going to be based on the unit size and then what type of utilities specifically the participant is responsible for paying outside of their rent. You're going to identify those utilities, you're going to find them on the utility allowance schedule, and that's going to give you the amount, the reasonable utility amount for your client. Next slide, please. Right. So we're almost there. You have calculated the client portion of rent for your client, and you've identified the utilities that they're responsible for paying and what the reasonable utility amount is on the PHA's utility schedule. If the cost of the utilities is less than the calculated monthly participant rent, right? So your client is supposed to be paying $200 in rent. and they have a utility allowance of $50, then you just subtract that $50 from the $200 client rent portion, and now their client rent portion is $150. Pretty simple. That's just taking into account the fact that utility costs are housing costs, and so they really are paying still $200 of housing costs, 150 of it in a rent payment, and 50 of it as paying for these utilities. In some cases, if your client is paying, their client portion of rent is minimal, maybe they have $20 monthly, which is their calculated client portion of rent, but the cost of utilities, the reasonable cost of utilities for them is $50. Then they're actually going to get a utility reimbursement from you out of your rental assistance funds or your leasing funds. So that's going to be the difference between what they should be paying and what they're paying in utilities plus rent. So in that situation, if they have to pay $50 for the utilities, but their rent portion of rent is $20, they're going to pay that $20 of rent, and they're going to pay the $50 of utilities. You're going to give them a payment to make up that $50, right? You're going to cover the utilities for them so that they're only paying their $20 of rent. So again, this is an overview, and we definitely want you to ask questions and follow up as you're putting this into practice. Talk to the people who have been doing this for a while in your organization, reach out to us, and we can help you put this into practice. The next couple of slides, so next slide, please. This goes over the ways that you can pay utility reimbursements, and unlike any other situation, so typically we don't make direct payments to program participants, but in the case of utility payments, that's actually the default. You can make a direct payment to a participant if they qualify for a utility reimbursement. So the amount they're paying in utilities plus their rent is actually greater than what they should be paying, so you're paying them back a little bit, you're covering part of it. You can also make a payment directly to your utility company, but you have to get the client's permission, and you have to notify the client that you're going to be doing that and maintain records that you're doing that, and you're notifying the client as you're making those payments. And then next slide, finally, make sure that you document all pieces of this calculation and keep it in the client file. It has to be in the client file, and you have to include both the tool that you use to calculate the rent payment and those pieces of documentation, the verification of information. So that is my whirlwind overview of client rent calculation. And I want to pause briefly to see if there are any questions right now about that. And if there are, you can throw them in the chat box. And as I watch the chat box for another couple moments, again, as you're doing this and putting this into practice, definitely reference these materials, use the tools that your agencies are using, and reach out to us, because we're happy to answer one-off questions or even get on the phone with you and talk through some tough situations if you're running into them. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions come into the chat, so I'm going to pass off for our next section to Monica.
Great. Thank you, Eli. And thanks again to everybody for hanging in with us during our whirlwind tour of all things housing. Next, we're going to revisit lease requirements through CoC funding and focusing on the Violence Against Women Act. We started today's training talking about the differences between leasing and rental assistance. So let's revisit those concepts now briefly, this time focusing on what is required to be in leases. Many people think of leasing and rental assistance as synonymous. However, leasing as a concept is fundamentally different from rental assistance. In projects receiving leasing funds, the project, noted on this slide as the recipient or subrecipient, contracts for the space from a landlord. So the project is primarily responsible for the housing or office space if it's being contracted to provide supportive services. If the space is being used for housing, the project goes on to execute an occupancy agreement with the participant. Occupancy agreements formalize the participant's rights in the housing, and specify program expectations regarding continued occupancy in the housing. Sublease or occupancy agreement requirements vary depending on whether the housing is transitional or permanent. So let's take a look at those differences in a bit more detail. In transitional housing, a sublease or occupancy agreement only needs to be for a term of at least 1 month and automatically renew for up to 24 months. Whereas in permanent housing, so PSH or rapid rehousing, a sublease must be for a term of at least 1 year and automatically renew. As Nicole mentioned earlier in this training is being recorded on June 22nd. And in response to COVID-19, HUD has made available a temporary waiver on the 1-year lease requirement for permanent supportive housing participants. So again, you'll want to check with your agency lead on whether your program is using this waiver. As compared to leasing projects, in rental assistance projects, participants lease directly with landlords. Similar to leasing projects, these leases may vary in length and standards depending on whether the housing is transitional or permanent. Transitional housing leases need to be for at least 1 month and automatically renew for up to 24 months. Permanent housing leases need to be for at least 1 year and automatically renew. And again, check with your agency lead on whether your agency is using a COVID-19 waiver on the 1-year lease requirement for PSH. Whether in a leasing or a rental assistance project, leases and occupancy agreements have a number of required components, including dates, a description of the premises, rent and security deposit, and other legal notices and disclosures. This has been a very quick overview of general CoC lease requirements, so I'll pause here to note a few sources of additional information. You can turn to the Santa Clara County CoC Quality Assurance Standards, the Santa Clara CoC Sample Lease Addendum, or of course, Homebase for additional information about CoC lease requirements or if you have any questions. So let's spend some time now getting into more detail about an important set of requirements related to the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, is a landmark legislation that recognizes domestic violence is an epidemic and provides a number of legal protections and resources for survivors of domestic violence. With each authorization, VAWA has grown stronger and more inclusive, and it includes protections for survivors in HUD-funded programs. Despite its name, VAWA protections apply to all genders. VAWA has a broad, inclusive definition of violence and includes protection for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. We'll use the term domestic violence as shorthand in this training. It can be difficult to identify and impossible to predict when domestic violence may occur, so CoC-funded projects need to provide each applicant and participant with a notice of occupancy rights and certification form at each of the following times: when the household is denied assistance, admitted to the program, receives notification of eviction, or is notified of termination of assistance. The notice of occupancy rights must include VAWA protections, including survivor rights of confidentiality and the prohibited bases for denying or terminating assistance, and limitations of VAWA protections, which we'll cover in a couple of slides. The certification form must be approved by HUD and provide space for the applicant to state that they are a survivor of domestic violence. And model forms are available on the Santa Clara County CoC website. Several provisions related to VAWA compliance are required for all leases. First, a statement that the landlord will comply with VAWA. including the prohibition on evicting a tenant due to domestic violence, and that domestic violence against a tenant cannot be grounds for claiming that they've engaged in a, quote, repeated or serious violation of the lease, or as good cause for terminating their assistance, tenancy, or occupancy rights. The lease may specify that VAWA protections only apply during the period of assistance under the CoC program. As I mentioned, there are some limitations on VAWA protections. Tenants may be terminated or evicted for a non-domestic violence related violation, so long as they're not held to a more demanding standard than other tenants, or if the housing provider can demonstrate an actual and imminent threat to others. The standard to demonstrate an actual and imminent threat to others is very high. It's a physical danger that is likely to occur within an immediate time frame and could result in death or serious bodily harm. Importantly, none of these limitations on VAWA protections can be used based on stereotypes. They must be tailored to particularized concerns about individual residents. Evicting or terminating a tenant should only occur as a last resort when there is nothing more that can be done, including options such as transferring the survivor, barring the perpetrator from the property, developing other plans to keep the property safe, or seeking legal remedies to prevent the perpetrator from acting on a threat. Again, this has been a very quick overview of lease requirements and the Violence Against Women Act. For additional information, we provided a more in-depth training on working with survivors of domestic violence this past February, and training materials are available on the CoC website. Thank you so much for your attention. For the final component of today's training, I'll turn it back to Nicole.
Thanks, Monica. So I know we've gone through a lot of information already, but I'm hoping you'll indulge me for just a little bit longer and we can power through housing quality standard inspections to round out this training. So with this section, we're ensuring that CoC funded housing in Santa Clara County meets federal standards. Next slide, please. So HUD has not created a CoC specific HQS inspection form. So CoC funded programs generally borrow from HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Programs, HQS. HCV's HQS were established in 1974 and haven't been updated since. It's intentionally vague because the regulations are national and they had to cover a large variety of housing stock. These standards can be both over and under inclusive. Where they're under inclusive, to fill in the blanks, you'll want to look to local and state laws and codes and the Housing Authority's administrative plan. You want to be especially familiar with local and state laws and codes pertaining to lead-based paint safety, fire codes, carbon monoxide detectors, and water and temperature standards. When there's a discrepancy between local and state laws and codes in HQS pertaining to safety, you'll want to follow the stricter of the requirements. Next slide, please. So the CoC interim rule requires HQS inspections of all units receiving leasing dollars and rental assistance through the CoC program. Subsidies won't be paid for housing that fail HQS unless the deficiencies are corrected within 30 days and those corrections are verified by the program. Programs can lose funding if monitored and found to not be in compliance. Now I'll note that, again, in response to COVID-19, HUD has made available a set of temporary waivers, and 2 of these waivers pertain to HQS requirements. The first one is regarding the initial physical inspection of the unit. With this waiver, the initial physical inspection can be waived for 6 months, starting March 31st, 2020. Programs implementing this waiver must instead visually inspect the unit using technology, such as video, to ensure that the unit meets HQS, and the program must have written policies to physically re-inspect the unit within 3 months after public health officials have determined that special measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 are no longer necessary. The second waiver is regarding the re-inspection of units. You'll note that the interim rule requires re-inspection annually thereafter. With this waiver, HUD waives the re-inspection requirement for 1 year beginning March 31st, 2020. Programs are encouraged to maintain regular contact with residents regarding housing quality issues that may arise, however. Again, these waivers are time limited, so if you're referencing this, you'll want to confirm the time eligibility to see if it's applicable to your agency or not. Next slide, please. So the CoC interim rule requires that HQS records are maintained for 5 years to demonstrate compliance, and we recommend maintaining lead paint inspections indefinitely to show due diligence in the case that an issue arises. Record keeping is vital. If you can't show HUD that you've conducted these inspections, in the eyes of HUD, they essentially did not happen. So if there's a takeaway from the slide, it's document, document, document. Next slide, please. Why are HQS inspections important? They promote access to safe, suitable housing regardless of income level, because a person shouldn't have to suffer in substandard housing because of their income. Also, having to pass inspections incentivize landlords to provide better housing stock for everyone. Substandard housing can be a public health issue. It can lead to increased asthma, lead-based paint poisoning, and environmental health issues. HUD wants people to be able to choose where they live while still ensuring there's a standard and a way to inspect that units are habitable. These standards are a floor, not a ceiling. They're intended to create a baseline, not create unreasonable standards that would limit housing stock. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, HQ standards can be general and vague, so a lot of times decisions will come down to your judgment and discretion. If it is not a matter of safety, then tenant preference rules. You want to respect the individual's self-determination. If a unit would fail for a reason related to tenant preference, HUD may be able to provide a waiver in some situations. Next slide, please. So for private units, every unit must have a living room, a bathroom, and a kitchen. Studio apartments count as having a living room. The second bullet point is a requirement per the CoC interim rule. It requires that there's at least one sleeping area for every 2 people. And finally, you cannot require older children of the opposite sex to share a sleeping room. It doesn't matter if children end up wanting to share a room, that's fine, but there needs to be sufficient space to have them sleep in 2 separate areas if that's desired. Next slide, please. So HQS can be very technical and have a lot of details, and we could dedicate an entire training to covering this. In fact, we do dedicate a training on this, and I really urge you to refer to our training slides and resources that are available on the CoC training webpage for further detail. But for this overview, we're keeping it very basic, and this is going to be a very high-level overview. So every room used for living must have adequate illumination. Here you're just looking that there's sufficient lighting. This can be either natural or artificial light. With electricity, you want to make sure that all the outlets are working, and you're concerned with electrical hazards and fires. So are there exposed or frayed wires? Are there improper connections? You're checking for overloading capacity. With windows and security, windows must keep elements out, but screens aren't necessary. You're looking to make sure there are no broken or missing panes. And for basement or first floor windows, they must have a lock. Bedrooms need to have a window. Kitchens and bathrooms do not, so long as they have sufficient ventilation. You also want to make sure that windows leading to a fire escape are not nailed shut. With ceilings, walls, and floors, minor scratches, water stains, and worn floors are fine. Here you're really looking for serious structural issues that could collapse. So you're checking for severe buckling or bulging, large holes, and danger of loose or falling materials. And finally, with lead-based paint hazards, this is another topic we could have an entire training on, and we will be having a training on this topic matter, so you can keep an eye out for that in the next coming months. But for this training, you should know that lead was often added to paints to make surfaces stronger and easier to clean, but it was then banned for consumer use in 1978. Children being exposed to lead dust or chips is a serious public health issue. It can lead to significant developmental delays and other health issues. If a unit is built prior to 1978, then before execution of the lease, the owner, in the case that it's a rental assistance unit, or the program, if it's a leased unit, is required to disclose knowledge of lead-based paint in the housing to all prospective residents. And in the case that a unit is built prior to 1978 and will house a child under the age of 6, a visual assessment on all surfaces must be conducted. And here you're looking for peeling, chipping, chalking, and cracking. This is often caused by moisture or poor surface preparation. If the affected areas are more than 20 square feet on the exterior or more than 2 square feet on the interior, the unit must be cleared. Next slide, please. Now we'll cover some general health and safety. So with access to the unit, exterior doors must be lockable. A chain lock only would fail inspection. You must be able to use and access the unit without having to go through other properties. And with fire exits, buildings must have alternate exits, so either fire, stairs, or a window with a ladder. Next slide, please. I'm going to cover this quickly just for the sake of time. So smoke detectors must be on each level of dwelling and installed in accordance with the National Fire Protection Association standards. Again, we want to note that you should check local fire codes for more details. And this is just an example of where HQS can be under-inclusive. Elevators must be working if they're present, and with interior stairs and common halls, you want to check that they're free of hazards. So here you're checking for loose, broken, or missing steps. Next slide, please. You're also going to want to check for evidence of infestation, so checking for droppings and gnaw marks. HUD doesn't explicitly address bed bugs, but that's likely a fail. You're also going to want to look and check that there aren't large piles of garbage and debris either inside or outside of the unit, and that all garbage have adequate covered facilities and lids. You also want to check for interior air quality, check for gas, mold, excessive dust, and pollutants, and then finally confirm the general safety and habitability of the area. So here you would check for general flooding, poor drainage, things of that nature. Next slide, please. So we've been focusing on private units, but HQS also applies to special housing types, and we'll cover some of the special requirements for the first two on this list. So shared housing, which is a building occupied by 2 or more families with a private space for the family and shared common areas, and SROs, single room occupancy, which is private living and sleeping space with a shared bathroom and kitchen, and this can only be occupied by 1 person. Next slide, please. So for SROs, it must be at least 110 square feet with at least 4 square feet of closet space, and it must be accessible without having to go through another unit, and there must be 2 or more means of exiting the building. Exterior doors and windows must also be lockable. Next slide, please. The building must have a sprinkler system and smoke detectors, and for shared bathrooms, there must be at least 1 toilet, sink, and bath or shower for every 6 people. And the bathroom must not be located more than 1 floor above or below the SRO unit. I'll note that lead paint requirements do not apply to SRO housing types. Next slide, please. For shared housing, the unit must have 1 bedroom for every 2 people, and there must be adequate space and security, which I understand is a bit vague and discretionary. And there must be access to a shared or private kitchen and bathroom. Next slide, please. So now we're just going to wrap up with some tips. So you want to use annual inspections as a selling point to landlords, because property owners generally want to keep their property in good working order. And you can use minor issues such as aesthetic wear and tear as a bargaining chip to lower rent. As I mentioned earlier, HQS can be incredibly technical and there are a lot of details. So when in doubt, consult a supervisor or expert. You may want to reach out to someone in your agency who's conducted inspections frequently, or you're always welcome. We really encourage you to reach out to home base for any questions you may have. And if it's an annual inspection, you want to speak with your tenant in advance about issues, and just be mindful that you're in someone's home. They might be especially vulnerable having someone come into their private personal space and feel judged, so you want to be mindful of that. And lastly, document and record thoroughly, because I cannot reiterate it enough. You need to document, document, document. I'm going to skip our poll just for the sake of time. Next slide, please. So as I said, this was a very high-level overview, but we do want to leave you with some resources. The first one, HUD's A Good Place to Live, is quite basic and easy to read, but it's good to share with tenants and landlords. The second one, which is HCB's Chapter 10, that goes a little more in depth. It provides more specific guidance and has a lot of useful templates. And the third one is a checklist that can be used to carry out these inspections. But you'll want to note that much of HUD's guidance is specific to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, so it may not apply to CoC-funded programs. Next slide, please. Now, we're almost at time, but I do want to give it a couple of minutes in case there were any questions about HQS that I can answer. And I'll keep an eye out on the chat box and just run through our little wrap up for today. So thank you so much for obliging us. I know it was a lot of information. We certainly do not expect you to have any of that memorized. This is our email address. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions you may have. We will be sending out an email letting you know when the recording along with the slides are updated to the CoC training webpage, so you can refer back to that. And we will also be sending out a feedback form. And we've tried to keep it as short as possible so that we're not taking up too much more of your time, but we'd really appreciate if you would fill that out. It really helps us and get better insight on what's working well and what's not. And I can personally assure you that I look through every single one of the feedback forms, and we do in fact use this to then inform our future trainings. And with that, it's 4 o'clock. I want to be mindful of time and just thank you so much for your time today and all of the very important work that you continue to do. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.